As I turned round, the eyelashes and the hair of the princess were moving, caused by the fan. And that just struck me, just for
a second you thought.
I had to turn away.
Diana, Princess of Wales, was the most influential woman of all time. She endeared herself to millions first through her youth and beauty, then through her humanitarian work, and finally through her willingness to buck the stiff upper lip and stonewall conventions of the British royal family. Unfortunately, the fateful car ride in Paris took the life of this powerful woman, leaving humanity with many unanswered questions about the true cause of her passing. Princess Diana's death had a significant impact on many people, including her driver, Colin Tebbit, who is still having trouble accepting it decades later. It was later proved that the driver, Henry Paul, was not under the influence. He was sadly the scapegoat to cover up her passing. Today, we'll discuss the shocking statement Tebbit made in a recent interview regarding the princess's tragic death. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind the conspiracy theories and rumors surrounding Princess Diana's death. The tearfully interview. 2 decades after the death of Princess Diana, her loyal driver still recalls the moment that made him crumple with grief in her Paris hospital room. Colin Tebbit was Diana's driver and security expert for over 2 years, but did not travel abroad with her. The loyal driver had only waved goodbye to the woman he called the boss just 10 days before the tragic accident. In his first live TV interview since the fatal collision, Colin struggled to hold back tears as he remembered bringing the mother of two's body home from Paris and said he always felt responsible for not being her driver on that fateful day. Following the princess's death in a car crash on August 31, 1997, Colin Tebbit was one of 2 of Diana's staffers who were dispatched to Paris to prepare to bring her body home to Britain. Colin spoke of the moment he arrived at the Paris hospital, where Diana's body was resting in a bed, with the whole world outside praying for her survival. As he gazed at her, Colin knew he must make the Princess of Wales beautiful, for her sisters and for ex-husband Prince Charles, who was arriving that afternoon to escort her body home. Diana's face was barely marked, but several hours spent in the stiflingly hot hospital room had taken its toll. Colin told how he desperately wanted Diana in death to be restored to her beauty in life, so he took the brave decision to invite a French undertaker to make up her face before the prince arrived. Colin says, "When I returned, she looked 100% better, but it was one of the hottest days of the year and the room was like a furnace." Diana's butler, Paul Burrell, then attended to her hair. Colin says, "He did her hair nicely, then he put a rosary on the bed." Then, as the room was getting hotter with the blankets, Colin asked for some fans. He switched them on, and as he turned around, her hair and eyelashes were moving. Just for that moment, he thought, "My God, she is alive!" Colin was in that shock. He said chokingly, "It was very difficult and emotional to see someone lying on a bed, not a mortuary. I could see people standing on a roof, which worried me because there were no curtains. So I got some blankets along the windows, which made it hotter in the room. I went and got some fans to cool the room down. That was the one moment in my life when my professionalism was lacking a little bit, because as I turned around, the eyelashes and the hair of the princess were moving, caused by the fan. That just stuck with me. I had to turn away, think about it, and get on with what I was doing." None of those who sat with Diana that afternoon. She was in the room at peace, with guards outside. In the room next door, Colin set up communications with London, making arrangements for the arrival of Prince Charles and Diana's sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows. When received the question if he could piece together what happened in the tunnel, Colin said, "I think they went in too fast. In the inquest, that was sorted out." Colin smiled as he spoke fondly of his friendship with the People's Princess, but said there was a line. He explained, "You don't cross that line. You speak to her when you're spoken to," which was correct. She was still very much a royal. We were often together in the car, and she had a tremendous sense of humor. Wherever we went, I never had a crossword in the 2 years. Never a crossword. The tragic night. Princess Diana died from injuries sustained in a car accident that occurred near midnight on August 31st, 1997. In an effort to evade the photographers who hounded her every move, Diana's driver, Henri Paul, was reportedly under the influence and speeding at nearly twice the posted limit in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. He lost control of the vehicle carrying the people's princess, her boyfriend, Dodi Fayed, and their bodyguard, and crashed into a wall of the tunnel, then into a pillar supporting the structure. Fayed and Paul have died instantly. Diana was still alive, and emergency services arrived to the scene within 5 minutes and transported her to a hospital. But she wouldn't survive. She ultimately succumbed to her injuries at 4:53 a.m. on that day. Diana suffered from a concussion, a broken arm, and a cut to her thigh in the crash, but what ultimately took her life were her severe chest wounds. Her heart was displaced in her chest, and she suffered a tear in her pulmonary vein that proved lethal and caused internal bleeding. After several hours in the operating room, surgeons were unable to get her heart to beat properly. It's been speculated that if Diana had been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash, she may have survived with only relatively minor injuries. The last days of Princess Diana. At 6:35 p.m. of the fated day, draped in the royal standard, Diana's coffin is carried to a dark blue hearse. The royal cortege departs the hospital for Villacoublay Military Airfield, where the coffin is transferred to an aircraft from the royal flight. Colin Tebbett recalls, "As we drove through the streets of Paris, everyone was applauding. It was amazing. Very, very moving. When we got to the plane, the two sisters decided they wanted to sit with Paul and me. The prince and his staff sit in a different compartment. At 6:51 p.m., a TV audience of 19 million watches the plane's arrival at Northolt in West London. 6 Royal Air Force pallbearers from the Queen's Colour Squadron lift Diana's coffin onto their shoulders. Police outriders from the Special Escort Group now lead the hearse out onto the A40. Too late, Diana is getting the police protection she had disastrously rejected. As the hearse passes under bridges, bystanders drop flowers onto the road. The hearse continues on to Bagley's Lane Mortuary in Fulham. There, Diana's body is formally identified by her sisters, and a post-mortem examination takes place. The royal doctor also examines Tebbett. The one is physically exhausted and mentally overwrought. His longest, most challenging duty is at an end. During September 1st and 2, Diana's body has remained under police guard overnight at the Fulham mortuary. It is now lying in a closed casket in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. All the windows in the chapel had been thrown open. In preparation for the funeral, the casket will later be moved to her apartment in Kensington Palace. On midweek, Diana's Paris luggage has ended up at Mohammed Al Fayed's office in the Harrods department store. Tebbett goes there to retrieve it on behalf of Diana's sisters. On the funeral, Saturday, September 6th. Colin Tebbett accompanies the family mourners to Euston Station and boards the royal train to Long Buckby, the nearest stop to Althorpe. Diana's coffin is driven to Northamptonshire in a hearse. There is a lunch before the interment. Then the mourners make their way to the shore of the Round Oval, a small lake in the grounds. Diana is to be buried on the island in the middle. Tebbett is one of the privileged few besides the close family to be allowed to the graveside. No police protection officers. Earl Spencer didn't want anyone else down there. The army had put a bridge across to the island. The coffin was lowered and the whole family went forward. That's how an inspiring life ended. It is not an accident. For some people, what happened that night wasn't simply a tragic accident. Instead, it was the result of some kind of conspiracy, conducted secretly by agents of the British state or something else. Numerous reports, investigations, and experts have all agreed with the official account of events. that Diana had been in a car driven by a man who was drunk, and that failing as well as other institutional ones allowed for the tragedy to happen. But others still believe that something more secretive and intentional happened that night. The conspiracy theories take a number of other forms, but all claim to point to the same fundamental belief, that someone wanted to kill Diana, and they helped orchestrate that night's fatal crash. Those conspiracies were so convincing and so widespread that the Met Police were forced to launch Operation Paget, an inquiry to establish whether there was any truth in the theories. It lasted years and cost millions of pounds. Diana was pregnant. This, according to Mohammed Al-Fayed, father of Diana's lover, was the reason for the killing. Diana had become pregnant with his son's child, he said, and that idea was unpalatable to the British state. Mr. Fayed said that the royal family could not accept that an Egyptian Muslim could eventually be the stepfather of the future King of England, and so it plotted to kill her off. Discussion of a potential pregnancy came up even before Diana died. During a holiday in France a few weeks before, some newspapers speculated that she might be pregnant, and that speculation was buoyed up by mysterious comments Diana made about a big surprise. But there was no sign of pregnancy during the post-mortem examination. Further tests on Diana's blood found there was no sign of pregnancy there either. And there's no evidence even that Diana suspected she may be pregnant. Numerous close friends and others said that her menstrual cycle was normal, that she was using contraception, and that she hadn't even mentioned the possibility of being pregnant to her confidants. Mohammed Al-Fayed described the royals as that Dracula family, and said that Prince Philip, who has German ancestry, a Nazi whose original name ends in Frankenstein. Al-Fayed claimed that the then Duke of Edinburgh arranged for the crash to happen because of racism, with the royals unable to abide Diana marrying a Muslim. He then added that Charles was part of the plan, which paved way for him to marry his crocodile wife. While the royals never spoke publicly about Al-Fayed, it's safe to say they weren't much impressed by his repeated allegations. However, in 2008, Al-Fayed said he will no longer be seeking any further lines of investigation after the car crash. He said, "Enough is enough, for the sake of the two princes, who I know loved their mother. I am sure they are blessing in their deep heart what I'm doing to discover the truth. I'm leaving the rest for God to get my revenge. I'm not doing anything anymore. This is the end." Diana believed she was going to be killed by the establishment. The main motivating factor behind the conspiracies is the belief that Diana herself thought she was going to be killed, and that much, it appears, is true. Chief among them is a letter that was disclosed by Paul Burrell, Diana's one-time butler, who said he had been given it for safekeeping. I am sitting here at my desk today in October, longing for someone to hug me and encourage me to keep strong and hold my head high. This particular phase in my life is the most dangerous. Is planning an accident in my car, brake failure, and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for Charles to marry, it read. The letter appears eerily prescient. And indeed, it had history. When Diana wrote the letter, she had experienced problems with her car, had voiced fears about them, and her bodyguard had died in an accident that she believed had been a conspiracy. Diana clearly had concerns about her safety. That much isn't a conspiracy theory. But there appears to be no official suggestion that she would actually be killed, even if there was animosity between some members of the royal family and Diana. The paparazzi made the car crash intentionally. Photographers were blamed repeatedly and continue to be for Diana's death. The story caught on in part because it reflected a concern that had pursued Diana throughout her life, that the often prurient interest in her was causing her harm. This theory has three specific forms. The first alleges that the group of paparazzi chased and pushed Diana's Mercedes so that it could make the crash happen. The second argues that members of the paparazzi encouraged an environment where a crash could happen. The third suggests that the paparazzi accidentally created a situation that the conspirators exploited to kill the people in the car. The official investigation pointed out that the paparazzi aren't really a meaningful group. Though they do the same job, they generally compete with each other for the best photo. Many of them work for different companies and do entirely different jobs, with some working as professional photojournalists. Official investigations have found that the Mercedes car that Diana was in does seem to have driven quickly, in part to escape the photographers. But Operation Paget found that was the result of normal behavior by the paparazzi and that they hadn't been participating in any criminal conspiracy. Driver Henri Paul intentionally caused the crash. Henri Paul was the head of security at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, but conspiracy theorists believe that he was in the pay of at least one other organization, the security services in France or the UK, or both. People who doubt the official course of events say that its central claim about Mr. Paul being drunk at the time of the crash was not only false, but was a lie spread in the media to cover up the killing. And that was done in part by swapping his body with another person, so that the toxicological results would appear correct. There are a number of reasons people believe this. Mr. Paul did not seem to behave like he was drunk earlier on in the night, for instance. And beliefs about him being in the pay of security services come from the fact that he appeared to have more money than would be expected, and that some security offices have suggested they might have had a French source inside the hotel. But there's no evidence to suggest that either of those things contributed to the crash in any way other than the official account. Numerous tests showed that Mr. Paul's blood had alcohol in it, though there were mistakes made with the tests, and repeated checks of those have certified that Mr. Paul had indeed been drinking. There was something wrong with the Mercedes that Diana was traveling in. There is perhaps nothing more central to the conspiracy than the car that carried Diana, and which would eventually kill her. Conspiracy theorists claim that its route was blocked, that it was driving at an unusual speed, or that something had been tampered with in the car. Everything about the car appeared to be in order. People reported seeing different speeds, and the car was certainly driving fast that night, but there was nothing unusual about the way it was driving. But a large part of the confusion here appears to emerge from the fact that it is simply too difficult to estimate speed. Witnesses who reported different things probably weren't wrong, but it's very difficult to tell how fast something is going when you're outside of it, especially if you don't have anything to compare it to. Bright flashes and strange vehicles were on the road. Numerous people reported seeing flashes as the car head into the tunnel where it would crash, flashes that were blamed for the crash itself. But the problem was that many people reported different flashes at different times from different places. There were a lot of flashes that night, the photographers following the car and the light of the headlights of the vehicles. But none of them appear to have been malicious or part of a conspiracy. Diana's medical care was deliberately sabotaged. Conspiracy theorists believe that doctors allowed Diana to die on purpose. By not treating her in the proper way, they stopped her from recovering. Most of this revolves around her treatment at the scene of the crash. If she had instead been taken to the nearest hospital and treated there, she may have survived, they say. Part of the belief in this theory comes from the fact that the French approach to emergency care is simply different from the UK. In France, emergency crews focus on giving treatment at the scene before moving a person to hospital. In the UK, it's about getting to the hospital sooner. As the writers of the Operation Paget report note, such a conspiracy would require a substantial number of expert doctors and other caregivers to both break their ethics and then lie about doing so. That didn't happen, they conclude. It's impossible to say whether or not there would have been more success if Diana was taken to hospital. But either way, doctors have said that it was almost impossible for her ever to survive her injuries. Diana's bodyguard was killed off. Conspiracy theories around Diana circulated even when she was alive, and indeed, the princess appeared to believe them. In 2004, U.S. news channel NBC aired video showing Diana talking about an affair with Barry Manicky, a former bodyguard who she described as the greatest love I've ever had. But it was all found out, and he was chucked out of royal protection. Then he was killed. I think he was bumped off, she said in the tapes. Conspiracy theorists took up that claim and suggested there was a mysterious driver who had apparently helped orchestrate the car crash that Manaki died in. He had been riding as a pillion passenger on a motorbike. That bike crashed into another car that was coming out of a junction intentionally, according to some. Cons rumbled on and became a part of the same set of beliefs that animate theories about what really happened to Diana. But The Independent found after an investigation published weeks ago that the truth was just as tragic, but entirely accidental. The driver of the car had actually stopped immediately and then agreed to help out with the investigation, including giving a statement to Operation Paget. Expert investigation reveals the truth. 2.5 decades after her tragic death, the late Princess Diana continues to make international headlines. Many questions remain about her final years, what happened the night she died, and who may be responsible for the accident. In Diana, the ultimate truth, a former detective and award-winning investigative journalist, Mark Williams. Thomas examines theories that have emerged since Diana's passing and sets out to answer the key questions that continue to swirl around the late Princess of Wales. Could she have potentially survived her injuries from the crash? Was driver Henry Paul under the influence of alcohol that night? And had her car really been tampered with? In November 1995, 2 years before her death, Princess Diana agreed to a television interview with Martin Bashir from Panorama, the BBC's flagship current affairs program. The revealing segment made headlines around the world after Diana exposed her and Prince Charles's extramarital affairs. As a result, the Queen urged Diana and Charles, who had been separated since 1992, to divorce, and Diana was stripped of the title of Her Royal Highness. Her royal security was also removed. How did Bashir, a relatively unknown BBC journalist, win this extraordinary interview and, crucially, Diana's trust? A graphic designer working for BBC later disclosed that Bashir had asked him to forge bank statements that showed a former employee of Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, had sold stories to a UK national newspaper. Bashir then showed the falsified statements to Earl Spencer to gain his confidence. Spencer then introduced Bashir to Diana. In Diana, the ultimate truth, Williams Thomas speaks with Tom Mangold, a longtime Panorama reporter who caught on to the deception and raised his concerns within the BBC. A friend of mine on the program came to me and said, "Our graphics artist Matt Wessler has told me that Martin ordered him to forge 2 bank statements," says Mangold, "and they were used to get the interview with Princess Diana." He took his concerns to the program editor but was ignored. 5 months after the interview aired, the Mail on Sunday newspaper revealed what Mangold knew to be true. But by then, the damage of what Diana divulged was done. Williams Thomas also meets with Diana's close friend Simone Simmons, who described Diana's conversations with Bashir prior to filming the interview. Bashir was talking about, "Did she realize, she is surrounded by people who are betraying her," says Simmons in the documentary. She said she didn't know how many enemies she had. During his investigation, Williams Thomas meets with other close friends and associates of Princess Diana, who describe a kind, strong-minded, and thoughtful person. They also reveal Diana's inner concerns in her final years. Speaking publicly for the first time, security expert Graham Harding explains how Diana feared her calls were being recorded and hired him to inspect her rooms at Kensington Palace for bugs. He also supplied mobile phones to Diana in secret to help her to avoid any potential surveillance. Concerns about being spied on were not Diana's only fear. Her close friend Roberto Dvorak says that Diana always believed she was going to die young. Dvorak said in the documentary, "She had the premonition she would be killed or die. Not in a natural way. She would say, 'I think they are going to kill me. I am going to finish in an accident. Helicopter, plane, or car crash.' Williams-Thomas retraces Diana's steps in Paris, where Diana spent her final days with filmmaker Dodi Fayed in August 1997, and tracks down crash witnesses who have never spoken publicly. He also travels to the UK to meet an expert who prepared a report for the official British inquest into Diana's death. Tom Treasure, a cardiothoracic surgeon, reviews the details of the crash. Diana was taken from the car, and she was conscious when they took her out. Her circulation was in trouble, fast pulse and low blood pressure, indicating internal bleeding. Treasure then explains the heart injury that Diana sustained from sitting sideways without a seatbelt when the car came to an abrupt stop. He reveals that, had the circumstances been different that night, allowing her rare heart injury to be identified earlier, she may have had a chance. Was the driver to blame? In 2008, the British inquest concluded that the accident was caused by the grossly negligent driving of chauffeur Henri Paul and the group of paparazzi photographers who were following the car. French police stated that Paul was under the influence of alcohol when he took to the wheel that night. But when Williams-Thomas tracks down his close friend Claude Garec, he insists that Paul was a responsible person who would not have put people's lives at risk. While in Paris, Williams-Thomas also questions Martine Montet, the police officer who led the French investigation into the crash, and reviews the forensic evidence. She confirms that the Mercedes had collided with another vehicle moments before entering the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, causing it to swerve, hit a curb, and spin into the 13th pillar. As for the widespread public theories that Paul's blood samples could have been inaccurate or switched, is there any truth to these claims? Blood samples were taken immediately at the time of the accident and also during the autopsy, says Monteil, who reveals that those samples indicated Paul indeed had alcohol, as well as antidepressants, in his system. He wasn't drunk, that's for sure, but he had consumed alcohol. Was the car tampered with? Following the French investigation, the Metropolitan Police in England launched their own inquiry into Diana's death. They commissioned 3 forensic and traffic collision experts to examine every element of the crash and determine if anything had been tampered with on Diana and Fayed's vehicle. Because of all the tampering allegations, I wanted the Met Police to buy or borrow an identical car, says David Price, a forensic accident investigator who went on to compare Diana's crashed vehicle with a second Mercedes to determine any differences. I was going from one to the other, checking out all the underside to look for any signs that anything had been attached to it or any signs that there had been a small explosion to disable something. The findings of the forensic team, along with all the other evidence gathered, may finally answer the remaining questions surrounding Diana's death.